Hey guys, today we are doing cropping the final row of an edge to edge. This is going to be applicable no matter what type of edge to edge you're doing or where your start point is on your design. So we are joining you today from the beautiful studios of Quilting Dreams for You, and we will be using the Pro Stitcher Premium system. So this system is currently set up on a Babylock Regalia, and by and away, this is hands down my favorite computerized quilting software. It's so much easier than so many of the others, and it's also super powerful. Oftentimes you have to trade off one of those two things, and this is that sweet spot that meets you in the middle. So once I have the majority of my quilt quilted and I'm down to the last row or half row, I typically want to crop off whatever is going to be hanging over my quilt. That leaves me with more usable fabric, less thread waste, less time waste. So this quilt, when I program my designs, I know the width of my quilt or the length of it. This quilt was run by the length, so I programmed in my width, which was 77 inches. However, when you quilt, there is draw as you quilt, and so the dimensions of your quilt will actually change slightly post-quilting. So now, even though I programmed it for the actual width that my quilt was when I began, it is no longer that length. So I have to come in and crop this final row. There are different ways you can do this. Some people will shrink it down. I personally find that it's more distracting to have different size leaves than it is to have a half of a leaf or whatever it may be for your design. So we are cropping off this row. So the first thing I'm going to do is, just as I would for advancing any other row, I will come to the start point of my previous row and position my design accordingly. Once I have my design programmed to where it will be in relation to the frame and in relation to my quilt, so the start point for my previous row was there, and it's going to tell me my start point is all the way down here, and I don't want to quilt all of this. So I'm going to come to my area and clear it, and then mark a new multi-point area. So when I'm marking my area, I want to go up above into the previous row of quilting just to be sure that I get my full design for this last row. I don't want to wind up with any like flat spots where I didn't quite go up high enough. So I'm going to do a multi-point crop, and I will come all the way around, marking my area. And I do go just a little bit over for good measure. So now that I have my area marked, I'm going to come to modify, crop, and I'm going to crop outside of my area. The next thing I'm going to do is hit edges. And what that's going to do is stitch a straight line across when it's on the outside of my quilt, as opposed to coming, tying off, jumping, stitching, tying off, jumping. It's just going to stitch straight across there because that's not going to end up in my quilt. It's much faster. And once I've done that, I baseline. From here, I just want to double check and make sure it fits within my area, which it does. I have plenty of room here. And then I'm going to jump to the next start point. And the reason that I do that is because I don't want to quilt the bottom of this row again. So I'm jumping to that next position, which will start me at the bottom row now.
Alrighty guys, so now we are going to take a look at our screen when we are cropping our final row of our quilt. So as everything is ready, I have my end point at the very last stitch on my quilt. So when I am at Pro Stitcher, New Start and End, that end point is all the way down at the very bottom. I have jumped to the start point of my last row. So my start point is here and waiting for me. My quilt is on the frame ready to stitch that whole last row, but potentially, most often what happens is my quilt may end like an inch or two up from the actual bottom of the design. So I don't need to quilt this entire last row. It will waste fabric, thread, and time doing so. I will begin by moving the crosshairs on my machine, so moving my needle and the whole machine to as far up top left as I can get it, and that ensures that I'm covering this entire row. I don't want to wind up accidentally cropping off the tip of a leaf or flattening out this curve on accident just because I'm trying to get super close to that. It's totally not worth that. I'd rather just go up an extra inch or so above where I know the top of this row is and select my multi-point. I will then go to the far right and select multi-point once more at that same plane, and then I'm going to come down to the bottom edge of my quilt and just multi-point all along that bottom edge. So if your quilt's not perfectly straight or perfectly square, you're not going to be quilting beyond the edge of that quilt, even if it's not square. So I'm just going to multi-point my way along. Once I have that programmed and that area is showing on my screen, the purple line is the outside edge of my quilt here. The blue line is my design. I am going to then come to modify and crop. So this is just the process for cropping the final row of my design. And I will then come to the right side of my screen and I'm going to select edges. That's going to be highlighted green so I know it is selected. What that does is stitch a straight line when my design comes to the edge of my area, as opposed to coming to that edge and then stopping and tying off and jumping to a next start point, tying off and then starting. Because I've cropped it to the edge of my quilt, that will either be just outside and it's going to get cut off when I trim my quilt off, or it's going to be in my binding, so that straight line will not show at any point. It is much, much faster to quilt with edges selected. If you have a design that falls within the area of your quilt, so if you're doing this within a border or something, I would not select edges. But because we're going edge to edge with this, I absolutely would. I'm then going to select outside, and it's going to crop anything off that is outside of that area that we have marked. So now we can see that it's starting at the edge of my quilt, and I'm going to come to the top left here and select baseline. That is a super important step, particularly with this process. If you do not select baseline, there's a glitch and sometimes it will crop off and not go to your start point, which is just annoying. So from here, I don't want to stitch the little bit of this previous row a second time. So I'm going to go to my Pro Stitcher tab at the top. And then I'm going to come to the right, and down at the bottom it has jumps. I'm going to jump down to the next start point. And so that's going to start on this next row of quilting so that I don't end up re-quilting a portion of the previous row. From here, I will hit run, make sure all my settings are to my liking, and then hit proceed. And it's going to slowly move your machine to the start point of that last row, and then it will begin quilting depending on what settings you have selected. There we go. And it is as simple as that. So now it's going to quilt this last row, and it's going to crop off actually at the very edge of my quilt so that I'm not wasting time or thread.
All right, thanks for joining us today. That was cropping the final row on your edge to edge. No matter what type of edge to edge you're doing, that process remains the same, which is super awesome. Yeah? And if you are new to the quilting world and are still sending your quilts off to be long-armed, or you haven't found someone to do that yet, we would highly, highly, highly recommend Quilting Dreams for you. That's the studio that we had the pleasure of using today in order to bring you this content. So we would like to send a special thank you to them, and also absolutely, they're the sweetest ladies and they will quilt your quilts beautifully, impeccably, and with the quality and precision that you also put into your quilts.
Okay.
Just a little slide blurb. This is all the lint from the thread. Cotton thread lints so much. So just know you need to be vigilant in cleaning out your bobbin case area if you're using cotton thread, because you don't want this getting stuck in there and changing your tension midway through your quilt. That sucks, I promise.